Floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Anthony. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will give folks a few minutes to log on and then begin the panel. So I'll repeat this again in a minute. But before we start, I want to share a couple of brief reminders. Tonight's session will be recorded and will be posted and shared online after the event. We encourage you to share it with anyone who you think would be interested in tonight's topic. While you can see us, we cannot see you. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. We will hold some time at the end for questions and answers. I'm just going to give folks until I think 6:03, and then we'll dive right into the main program.
Jen, I thought you were going to do warm-up jokes.
My rider included extra money for that, and they did not agree. So we cut that. We cut that.
Well, Jen, I'm sorry to say then we'll have to skip our opening act. And I guess we'll get ready to dive into the main program. So I'll just repeat myself quickly. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are about to get started. Before we do, I just want to share a couple of brief reminders. So tonight's session is being recorded and will be posted and shared online after the event. We encourage you to share it with anyone who you think would be interested in the topic. While we can see you, or while you can see us, we cannot see you. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and we will hold some time at the end for questions and answers. With that said, let's begin. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's panel discussion. Our topic, of course, is the ACORN Legacy, Lessons from 40 Years of Building People Power. The Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now was founded in 1970 and grew to be one of the largest and most powerful poor and low-income people-led community organizations in the country, fighting battles to end redlining by big banks, register voters, and raise wages for working people, all until the organization was forced to shut down in 2010 following major internal tensions and attacks from the right. We will use our time together tonight to explore some of the important lessons learned from ACORN's long and storied history, including how they built a multiracial, member-led national organization and how and why it came under attack from the right, and what its whole story can offer our movement today. My name is Matthew Hansen, and I will be tonight's moderator. I've worked on and led local and statewide electoral and legislative campaigns and previously worked for the Working Families Party for 8 years, an organization that in many ways grew out of ACORN. I'm currently the Chief of Staff at DC Action, a nonprofit in the District of Columbia that uses research, data, and community organizing to advance racial equity. And I've served on the content committee for the online publication, The Forge. I'll begin by introducing our 3 distinguished panelists, each of whom will open by exploring a different aspect of ACORN's history and why it's relevant today, followed by a deeper dive into lessons for today's movement building efforts. We will hold time at the end for additional discussion and any questions from the audience. Our first panelist will be Steve Kest. Steve worked for ACORN for more than 30 years. While at ACORN, Steve helped build it from a single organization in Little Rock, Arkansas, into the nation's largest and most powerful membership organization of low and moderate income families with chapters in over 30 states across the country. From 1998 until 2009, he served as the organization's national executive director. Prior to assuming that role, he ran the National Policy, Legislative, and Campaign Office. And earlier, he ran citywide and state ACORN organizations in Arkansas, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Florida. Under Steve's leadership, ACORN won successful campaigns to raise the minimum wage in multiple states and cities, challenged and won reforms in how financial institutions treat low-income communities of color, and developed effective models for engaging parents in campaigns to improve urban school systems. Since then, Steve has worked for SEIU, where he ran the Fight for a Fair Economy project, a national campaign to raise up issues of income inequality, low wages, and access to good jobs, and helped seed the Fight for 15. Since then, he has served as a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and since 2025 has served as senior advisor at Popular Democracy. Our second panelist will be Christina Livingston. Christina worked as an organizer with ACORN in Los Angeles from 2004 to 2010. She's been organizing for more than 2 decades. She is currently the executive director of the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, or ACE, and helped form ACE Action and ACE Institute in 2010, where she worked for 2 years as statewide deputy director before becoming executive director. In her organizing career, Christina has worked on campaigns that addressed equitable infrastructure investment, progressive revenue solutions, housing equity, access to high quality and well-funded public services, corporate accountability, good government, representative voter engagement, and criminal justice. She views her work from the intersection of racial and economic impacts and is passionate about centering the voices of people of color, poor folks, and women. And last but not least, our third panelist will be Jen Kern. For 15 formative years, Jen worked in the national office of ACORN, including 10 years as the director of ACORN's Living Wage Resource Center, which served as a clearinghouse for the national living wage movement and provided direct organizing support for the campaign driving the effort. After leaving ACORN, Jen worked as the minimum wage campaign coordinator for the National Employment Law Project, or NELP, before joining the Working Families Party in 2013. She's currently WFP's alignment director, where she focuses on supporting WFP operations, building state power. And with those introductions, let's begin. Steve, I'd like to turn to you and ask you to provide a brief historical overview of ACORN and tell us about its organizing model. But before you do, I was hoping that maybe by way of introduction, you could share with us what brought you to ACORN in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Glad to be here. So I came down to Arkansas in 1973 to work with ACORN, the only place ACORN was at the time. And really, I was looking for a way. I'd been active in the anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, and was looking for a way to engage with a more broad-based working class, lower income constituency than we really were focusing on in anti-war organizing. And I wanted to learn about community organizing. I had done some tenant organizing at college, but really I didn't know what I was doing. So I went to Arkansas, which is where ACORN started. And what I discovered was pretty, amazing operation. So ACORN had been started in 1970 by Wade Rathke. It was really a sort of outgrowth of the National Welfare Rights Organization, where Wade had been an organizer. And the National Welfare Rights Organization was really the first and only organization it was a membership organization of welfare recipients, mostly Black welfare moms, who were fighting the sort of racist and humiliating treatment they were receiving as welfare recipients. And they were aiming to make reforms, dramatic reforms in the welfare system. But the welfare movement had, a built-in limitation, which is that the constituency was a relatively small and powerless group. And sort of the germ of the ACORN idea was to build something broader that had more power by combining the welfare constituency with a broader working class constituency. And that's really what ACORN did. I mean, when I got there, ACORN had like a dozen neighborhood chapters in Little Rock, a city of only 150,000 people. And we had chapters in every poor and working class neighborhood in the city, white, Black, mixed. And I quickly got thrown into and learned how to do organizing by doing an organizing drive, which was how ACORN got built. So, we would find an unorganized neighborhood by knocking on doors, find people who in the neighborhood who were potential leaders. They might run a block club, they might run a parent association, they might run a daycare. And we, with those folks, form an organizing committee in the neighborhood. and then collectively knock on every door in the neighborhood, agitating people at the door, with deep one-on-one conversation. What are the issues? What are you concerned about? What are you pissed off at? What are your dreams for the community? And what would it be like if we could form an organization of everyone in the neighborhood to try to address those issues? And most importantly, we signed people up as members when we were on the doors. At the time, membership was $1 a month as membership dues. And after a month or two of knocking on doors, we whittled a founding meeting of the neighborhood chapter. 100, 200 people would come together in a church basement, elect officers, because it was a democratic organization, and then choose what issue or issues to work on. And often enough, the first issue would be something winnable, get the city to clean up a vacant lot or put a stop sign up at a dangerous intersection. But through working on that issue, which often involved people gathering together in groups and going to City Hall, people learn the value of collective action, and then move on from that issue to larger fights. And like I said, in Little Rock, we had like a dozen neighborhood chapters, and the officers of each sat on our citywide board and chose bigger citywide issues that impacted everybody in the community, everybody in the city. In Little Rock at the time, we did a lot of work around sky-high utility rates, fighting the utility companies. And that basic model is how we sort of built and replicated the organization. At our peak, as you mentioned, 30 states, there were hundreds and hundreds of neighborhood chapters, 500,000 or so members, all these leaders that were developed through those local neighborhood campaigns, who then came together on citywide fights, statewide fights, and ultimately national fights, which we'll talk about, I think, as we go along.
Thanks, Steve. And Steve, could you maybe expand a little bit more about the climate and culture that ACORN developed and grew up in, so to speak?
I mean, it was, community organizing was relatively new as a project. At the time, there were some early efforts. There was IAF organizing, which was church-based. There were some early SDS, Students for a Democratic Society experiments. But really, ACORN sort of developed the model and became sort of the premier example of community organizing. What was unique, among the many things unique about ACORN, I think, were one, the sort of emphasis on membership dues. So members really own the organization. Second, the emphasis on membership leadership. So again, electing officers, choose the issues, speak for and lead the organization. And then I think unique at the time as well, ACORN engaged in political activity. We had a separate ACORN Political Action Committee, which interviewed, endorsed candidates, supported candidates for office, and early on had a model which said, we want to force elected officials to do our bidding. If they don't, we're going to get rid of them and replace them with better folks. So all of that, I think, was sort of unique in that early 70s, throughout the 70s and up into the 80s period of organizing. So that was sort of that early environment that we engaged in.
Thank you. And I want to maybe use that as a bridge to tag Christina into the conversation. So Steve talked about it a little bit, Christina, but obviously one of the things that ACORN was best known for was the role that members played in the organization. And in fact, it was really central to the organization's model. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of being a member-led organization, the process of leadership development for those members, and also how it influences your work and ACE's work today.
Absolutely, thanks. The thing that I most regularly say to people when they ask about leadership development at ACORN or at ACE is that the orientation of so many organizations is to start with some kind of policy and then convince people that that's the right policy and move it that way. And that, you might get some people who agree with you, but there's not many people who are really going to own whatever that is. That model might get you some thin layer of support. And that's usually not enough for the kinds of policies you want to win. So it's always a losing strategy to start with policy. If you start with people in a real way, you better understand what the real issue is that is impacting people so that you're not fighting for the wrong solution. You better understand what are the kinds of solutions that people want to get behind. Like, what is a real community solution? Even if they don't themselves understand what the policy is or exactly that what they're speaking to as a solution. If you get a bunch of people who are similarly impacted in a room and you ask them how it's impacting them and you ask them what they want to see, if you get the right people in the room with them, they can craft a policy out of that. So they will give you the right solution. And then not only will if you really develop leaders, will they be integral in crafting the campaign and therefore running the campaign and being very connected to the campaign, they will not let you back down and start to compromise when you otherwise think that there's no other choice. They will be the ones to sort of hold you honestly to what it is at the heart of what you're trying to win and tell you if you should make a deal or not make a deal. And over again, we've seen in our organizing then and now that we win way more when we actually let people lead, as opposed to when we thank you for your input and then go off and do the work ourselves. So it's just so important to not think about leadership in a way that's just about humanizing an issue. I think lots of people say that in a way that they feel good about, like, oh, you have to put a human face to an issue, which of course you do, but then you are actually taking advantage of, sort of just utilizing them as a part of your own campaign that doesn't take into account their wisdom, doesn't take into account their power, etc. You have to let them be the voice that leads you. And I will say that over and over again in coalition spaces, when we're at odds with what to do next, we have always said, I don't know who you're speaking for. I'm telling you what people who are actually impacted want to see happen. And that doesn't always rule the day, but it does give us a lot more courage in the conversation to keep pushing and decide if we need to go our own way, if we need to find a different, constellation of support to be able to deliver for our folks. We have a responsibility to deliver for our folks because they are essentially our bosses. And I think what's more than that is that because we elect people to be representatives of, their chapters, if those are not real leaders, and they're just sort of figureheads, they don't experience real power. And the point of building power for people is that they can experience power. They can experience being a representative of power. They can experience collective power. They can experience their own agency in a constellation. All of those things mean that we get at the back end an organization that's not just, people who will fill a seat, which sometimes is, what you need, not just people who will send an email, but actually people who are deeply invested and will drive the campaign forward in a way that you may not have even sort of anticipated originally. And so some of that in sort of the ACORN way that we were taught is from the very beginning. You knock on their door, you join them as a member, you go to their house a couple days later and you give them an assignment. They start leadership immediately. And it's, can you make these phone calls? Can you pass out these flyers? Can you speak in front of this room of your neighbors? And they are most likely going to hesitate and say no. So we actually are building leadership. And the best thing is when they say no, because that means that they don't want to hog the spotlight. They are, we were taught early about how to identify who is a leader. It's not the loud person necessarily. It's not the person who wants to be at the front of the room. It's the person who has some humility and the person who doesn't want to get it wrong. They don't want to, speak out of turn on behalf of other folks. So we were taught ways early on how you get them engaged. And then and then daily, how you keep them engaged and how you ask them to get other people engaged. So it was such a central part of our work, and we've kept almost every piece of that in ACE's work today. Like that's such. Actually, I will say there was in Los Angeles this weekend a 6-month planning meeting with 50 leaders, and the Instagram post from one of our organizers, she's been around for like 2 years, was, this is what it looks like when members actually lead your organization. And it was all of these leaders who had been sitting in a room, all afternoon talking about housing, talking about authoritarianism, talking about ICE raids, and they knew it and they ran it and they made decisions about it. So it is totally one of the main pillars of what we've kept on the back end of ACORN and ACE's work.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think I just want to lift up and emphasize one of the points that you're making too, that it's not just about humanizing an issue, it's really about building power for people who are directly impacted. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, maybe expand on that a little bit more, to talk about how power building has changed since your time at ACORN to today. Like, what's changed in the culture, what's changed in the movement, and sort of how you are still leading that process.
Yeah. I think more people today understand the true value of power building. There's a lot, it actually became sort of a buzzword for a while, which lets you know that at least in spirit, people understood that power building was not about winning an issue, that power building was actually about developing skills and tools and collectivity that can be used in any number of issues and in any direction that people are really ready and willing to go. That certainly didn't feel like it was the case when I first started organizing. It also, I think, has though kind of expanded so that it's not just about the power building of individual people, but power building of the ecosystem of organizations that do power building, so that we can move in more concert together in ways that, previously it felt like there was a lot of competition. It didn't feel like there was a lot of real competition between organizations, and it was about cash and it was about credit, and people were trying to sort of elbow other folks out of the way. I think we've gotten a little bit past that. I think one danger is that one reality of leadership development in ACORN was that the organizers were told to be sort of out of sight. Like, members are leading this meeting, members are leading this conference. You can whisper a suggestion, you can, try to make sure people are in the right place, but you're not the face. There was a bit of a trend where organizers started to feel like they should be a little bit more central. Like, I have a story too, which is true. But when we get in our own fight, if we are putting ourselves in the fight, it makes it much harder to objectively facilitate what it is that other people want to do. So I think we actually have lost a little bit, or had lost a little bit of the purity around power building for whom and to what end as an organizer, that I think we could course correct on and would make us a bit stronger again. There's been, I think the trend was there, and then COVID hit and it got very what about us? What about me? And my own needs in this moment, which are very real, but also can really get in the way of power building if you put yourself in the center.
Thank you. And I'd love to come back to that a little bit later when we talk about lessons learned. Before we transition to our next topic, I did want to ask, because I skipped over this, if you wanted to share any more about what brought you into ACORN and what your entry point was to the organization.
Sure. So I grew up in a small town in California, Hemet, and it was not a very political, it was, my family wasn't political. I didn't know anything about politics. I didn't know anything about protests. I didn't know any of that. I did have a lot of personal feelings of shame about the situation my family was in, about our poverty, about my dad's being in jail for several years. I didn't know how to make sense of it. I went to school and started to learn about sociology and like that there are actual structures that are built to put people in these kinds of positions. Not that you are a caste system, but that like, it's actually hard to overcome these things. Like that didn't ever occur to me. So I studied sociology for 4 years. At the very end of those 4 years, I was in a sociology class. A union person came in and said, there's an internship for union summer. I didn't have a job lined up. So I was like, great, that'll be some money for the first couple of months. I went there and learned door knocking organizing. This is 2004. This is the very beginning of Working America with AFL-CIO. So I knocked on doors under Working America. And at the end, I thought, I actually really love this, talking to community members. I don't love being in, a different state. Like I want to go home. And so how can I do that? And they said, well, maybe look up community organizing, maybe look up ACORN. So I did. And a couple weeks later, I was door knocking in LA and never left. Like I didn't realize it was a job, but once I recognized like, oh, this is exactly like what I would have loved this if somebody had knocked on my door. And watching people go down that path, connect their own stories the way that I did, like I was hooked. So that's what brought me in and kept me.
That's incredible. Absolutely love it. Well, you also brought up something about the importance of a movement ecosystem. And Jen, I'd love to have you sort of pick up and explore this a little bit more. So Jen, you bring a different perspective to tonight's discussion. You worked as a researcher and the director of ACORN's Living Wage Resource Center. Research and a resource hub might be an aspect of the organization that some people are not as familiar with, but still offer valuable lessons for today, including the importance of experimentation in movement work. Could you start by telling us a little bit about what brought you to ACORN, and then speak to the contribution ACORN made to the campaigns and movement ecosystem that went beyond its traditional organizing model? And not only the importance of experimentation in movement work, but the importance of generosity in our field and in our movements.
Yes, thank you, Matt and Steve and Christina, everyone who's here. I'm Jen. So what brought me to ACORN, I can do quicker. It's a point of insecurity because I basically stumbled into ACORN years, whereas it feels like a lot of my ACORN peers seem to have like studied left movements, or Saul Alinsky, who is the famous community organizer whose model inspired ACORN. And then they graduated from college with like a specific goal of working as a community organizer for ACORN, the premier, community national grassroots organization at the time. And I kind of stumbled into it. I studied, in a liberal arts college, and I studied gender and African American history, but I thought I was going to go to grad school and be a like anthropology person. So I graduated from college and I was working for like $500 a month on a stipend for an organizing project that was aimed at empowering young women in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And I just was running out of money and working for a temp agency, and I was desperate for a real job. And I went to one of the volunteer meetings of the project I was working on, and I just asked for leads for jobs. And it turns out that one of the volunteers at the Young Women's Project where I was working was the national grant writer for ACORN. And she's like, look, they're always hiring. So that's kind of how I got to ACORN. I mean, there's an activist and stuff, but it's not like I was looking to work for ACORN. And so I thought it would just be a stint until I went to like grad school in applied anthropology. And when I got the job, I made clear that I thought I could give them about 6 months. And I stayed for 15 years. So that's my entry story. It's not very romantic, but there it is. So I had various jobs at ACORN. The one I was asked to speak about is something that maybe people, it's sort of a little bit off model. I worked at the national organization, so I did a lot of support for various campaigns over the years. And research at ACORN means like, go figure out if you can get the Allstate rate manual, because we're going to go after Allstate for discriminating on homeowners insurance, and figure out like go walk through some local schools and get a sense of like, what are the things that we could tell every city to walk through their local schools and do an inequality survey about public schools in our neighborhoods. So I did that kind of stuff for a while. And then the thing I've been asked to talk about is the ACORN Living Wage Resource Center. So there are a few things about this project that were a new experiment for ACORN and perhaps a little against our grain. And I'm reminded of sort of I don't want to use the word intermediary, but like we have intermediaries today that are very different than this one. So as I'm telling the story of the Living Wage Resource Center, it might be helpful for people to think of like where that has gone in today's world, and we'll do lessons later. But like this was a attempt by ACORN to actually resource campaigns that were happening nationally and create almost like a resource center for those campaigns, because we thought it would actually it would fuel the flames of something that had begun organically. So I will give an overview of the Living Wage Resource Center, and I'll start by providing some context. So in the early mid-90s, workers' wages were low. I don't know if that comes as a shock to people, but low-wage workers were paid, very low wages. And at the same time, I hope everyone's sitting down, corporate profits were high. So this was in a moment where the federal minimum wage was stuck at $5.15 an hour, and there had been of course a national coalition of groups trying to like unstick the federal minimum wage, but the appetite in Congress for that was pretty low, and it seemed like it would be a years-long slog. And actually, an interesting point is after years of the federal minimum wage being kind of raised regularly, during the Reagan years, the federal minimum wage had basically become an ideological issue. So it was sort of frozen in place by the free marketeers and the deregulators. And as a result, its value had plummeted against the cost of living. And there wasn't hope that like the Congress of the early 90s would like bridge politically what the market had eroded. And so labor and community groups who did actual local and state work got impatient to deliver to our members. And we started trying out various campaigns to get at this need for good jobs for our members. And after a couple of false starts, which could be a whole other panel, a few cities, Baltimore, Boston, LA, Chicago, found real sense with what we now know as living wage campaigns. And for folks who don't know, the basics of that were we thought about what do we have control over? How do we use any levers of control to raise wages for workers? And the two ways that living wage campaigns did that was by attaching wage standards to service contracts that cities let out, and to economic development subsidies that cities or counties gave to people building, strip malls or stadiums. And so we thought if we can attach wage standards to the giveaway of tax dollars, that's a good angle for us to raise wages for people and to begin the conversation. It had a public money angle, and it had a smaller number of workers covered, so we could demand wages that were way higher than the minimum wage. So we were trying to get at that problem of the gap in the federal minimum wage with the cost of living. So we were demanding in living wage campaigns $10, $11, $12 an hour, again, because we had this sort of it's our tax dollars angle, and we had that doesn't cover as many workers as a minimum wage would. So one note is that at this time, thinking about municipal policy as a driver of wage standards was pretty novel. It wasn't a thing that we had done before. And that's what's one of the most exciting things about this movement. It was like a kind of an intervention in this level that we hadn't tried before. So because ACORN had led both the Chicago and Boston living wage campaigns, they were really contentious, high profile, and really successful. We started getting calls from around the country, all over, from like random people wanting to start campaigns in their cities. And they were all kind of asking similar questions about like, what are the elements of living wage campaigns? And so we decided to start the Living Wage Resource Center to support like any and all campaigns on this topic. So we set aside our normal focus on the ACORN brand, and we just committed to fanning the flames of what felt like it had the potential to be a like truly nationwide coalition movement, labor, community, and had the potential to actually tap into this deep vein of resentment around low wages, corporate subsidies, and like our cities like submitting to both of those things. So the sort of spokes of the Living Wage Resource Center hub, I'm just going to name a few. So ACORN didn't pretend to be the Living Wage Resource Center. We did our part. We knew what we knew from our campaigns and our lane as community organizers and campaigners and accurate power assessors. And then we performed what I think in the old days we would call like a Rolodex function with other key players. I don't know if everyone knows what a Rolodex is, but we connected people to other key players who were committed to supporting the movement from their specific area of expertise. So some examples of that were Paul Son at the Brennan Center for Justice did legal briefs about like, yes, we do have the right to raise wages in this way, did some drafting of the legislative of the policies all around the country and tweaked them as the years went on based on what we've learned. We had economists calculating the cost of what is a living wage. We had other economists doing it won't cause prices to go up. We had other economists doing it won't bust budgets. We had other economists looking at the impact of the early living wage laws and saying, look, nothing bad happened. So we had labor leaders, largely on the West Coast and the East Coast, but who were saying from some of the more progressive unions, this is a way to build bridges with community organizations and inject wages into the public discourse and raise the floor on wages that then our contracts can build upon. So we had labor leaders who were making that argument in the labor movement. We had folks focused on media training. We had folks who were like in the anti-corporate subsidy world, who were like feeding us data and messaging around that. So we had like a world of people in their lane supporting this movement. Specifically at ACORN, the things we did besides, I think the main thing we did was just the day-to-day hand-holding, plotting, planning, commiserating, connecting people with all these other functions. And so our highest value was connecting organizations in states with ACORN, leading those campaigns and teaching them about what we learned in those campaigns is like community organizers, like how to, turn it into a political campaign, how to build your leadership with that. And we were leading campaigns in Philly and Sacramento and St. Louis and Little Rock. And so we had that day to day. We also wrote a 200-page handbook with practical guidance and case studies and sample flyers. We hosted 3 conferences. I traveled all over the country from Honolulu to San Francisco to Manhattan, Kansas to Birmingham, Alabama, sitting down with the campaigns and the leaders and speaking in union halls and libraries and church basements. And we did all of those things in service to trying to seed a movement. And I just wrote down a couple things that are like lessons that came from that, from our experience doing that. One is that it was largely unstaffed. That didn't mean that paid labor and community and organizations or legal or policy organizations weren't involved. But the thing that made it feel like a movement that was spreading organically is that there were so many unpaid, committed folks. And the professionals were just sort of fertilizer, I think, for that organic growth. People were super clear about their lanes. They just stayed in their lanes. We didn't look to joint fundraise. We just stayed in our lanes and did the thing that we did best that supported the movement. We didn't brand it any one thing except the living wage movement. It actually helped bridge some divides between labor and community. And then I think most importantly, it became a signifier of a larger problem around economic inequality and growing corporate power that went way beyond the actual limits of the policy. It went way beyond the number of workers covered, and it fed into and made possible the successful statewide minimum wage ballot measures. It made possible the 2007 federal minimum wage increase that eventually happened. And then importantly, I think it helped seed it was a precursor to the historic Fight for 15. And then the last thing I think is it built relationships of trust and solidarity across the movement, many of which are still going strong today and have fueled subsequent campaigns and victories that to this day.
Thank you so much for that overview, Jen. And I think it really speaks to the importance not just trying to lead campaigns or lead a movement, but also seed campaigns. And I think that generosity is really key today. And I think something that Christina was underscoring a little bit earlier. I want to turn the page now to a different chapter in ACORN's history and ask Steve and Christina to talk a little bit about this. So as probably some folks are familiar with, ACORN was an early target of attacks from the right that many organizations and movements are experiencing today. So as our panelists have discussed tonight, at its peak, ACORN was one of the most powerful national membership organizations in the country. And because of the power it built, especially through massive voter registration drives and grassroots campaigns, often against corporate targets, and the multiracial working people it represented, ACORN was targeted by the right. So, Steve, I was hoping you could maybe tell us a little bit more about this history and what those attacks represented and how we should understand them today. And then, Christina, I'm going to ask you to follow up on Steve if there's anything that you want to add to that, but also talk about how do we build solidarity with our partners and our funders and others today? Because that, I think an important lesson from that story is that solidarity wasn't necessarily in place, wasn't necessarily there the way we wanted it to be when ACORN came under attack.
Yep. Thanks, Matt. Yeah. I mean, you're accurate in saying that ACORN was a threat, which is why we were attacked. And, Jen sort of underplayed the impact, I think, of the minimum wage, living wage campaigns. We raised wages for millions of workers around the country, taking profits out of their corporate employers. We ran campaigns targeting banks for their redlining policies. We ran campaigns against financial institutions for foreclosures. We ran campaigns against housing developers to demand affordable housing. All of that work made us a lot of enemies. And I think probably the most significant campaign that we ran that sort of led directly to the attacks was the voter registration work that ACORN did. ACORN, in collaboration with a Project Vote, which became a part of ACORN, registered close to 1.5 million new voters, mostly Black and brown, in the run-up to the 2008 federal election, which was, the Obama McCain election. In the course of running that voter registration campaign, we ran into the first examples of what has become a sort of chorus from the right wing ever since about voter fraud. Their claim that somehow by registering voters who hadn't yet had a chance to vote, we were committing fraud, which really was an argument that these mostly lower income voters of color didn't really have a right to vote, didn't have a right to be part of our democracy. So that campaign combined with all the rest just put a target on our back. And we were a big visible organization, right? All of the local ACORNs all over the country, they all were called ACORN. California ACORN, Minnesota ACORN, New York ACORN, Philadelphia ACORN. They all have the same red T-shirts and the same, banners and the same symbol. And all of that was a strength. It meant that, we could take a living wage victory in one place and people would hear about it and then would try to replicate it in somewhere else. But it also meant that our enemies, they knew who we were everywhere. And so there was this vast right-wing conspiracy that we first uncovered that went after us. Glenn Beck, who's still around, he used, he's now, I think, mostly a web internet presence, but he, had a show on Fox and would run a series of shows day after day after day, talking about ACORN and voter fraud, and putting us up on bulletin boards with all the various funders and drawing the lines and arrows and all the connections, all the people that Jen worked with on the Living Wage Resource Center, making all the connections. They, in their case, claiming that we were part of the conspiracy. And then so voter fraud became, the sort of mantra about ACORN. And then they ran the first of the projects that O'Keefe, what's his first name? I think he's gone to jail. Yeah.
It's O'Keefe and Project Veritas.
Project Veritas, back when no one heard of him and no one knew the ways in which he tried to entrap organizations. He ran a whole attack on ACORN where he and Confederates came into our offices and put together sort of constructed videos trying to demonstrate that we were, helping get mortgages for people who wanted to create brothels and various other, claims that they were making. And Fox ran those tapes day after day after day after day. And then, we had our own internal sort of problems that sort of contributed to all of this in the organization's history. But really, those attacks, this was the first time that the right wing had gone after an organization like this, really in anyone's memory. I mean, there was the Red Scare back, the McCarthy period, but that was way past, way earlier. No one remembered that. This was new. And for a lot of organizations that we had worked with and elected officials and foundations, they're feeling, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. And they ran from us. Foundations ran from us. Many elected officials who were powerful in the Democratic Party and are still powerful in the Democratic Party said, no, we can't. This is like too much. We can't support ACORN. Candidate and then President Obama, who had worked with us, provided training to ACORN members in Chicago, and then ran the Project Vote office in Chicago at one point. I can't, was not willing to stand up and defend us. Foundations were not willing to stand up and defend us. And so in the end, I think the absence of cross-movement solidarity is what led to ACORN's demise. Funders ran away, electeds ran away, the name in many cities and many communities across the country became tarnished. And in the end, we had to sort of put ACORN into bankruptcy, and the organizational structure was sort of put to rest. Now, a lesson currently, and I'll ask Christina to say more about this, but a lesson currently is as our organizations are coming under attack now, I think we have learned the lesson of solidarity. But also one of the things that, we are encouraging organizations now to think about is just because an organizational form, the corporate name, goes under, all of us survived, and the members and leaders of the organization survived and created new entities and new structures who are just as strong in many respects, learned many lessons, went on to continue doing the work. So the movement and the people in it survived those attacks to go on to continue doing the work we all need to be doing.
I'm going to jump in really quickly because we have about 10 minutes left in our panel, and I'm going to pass to Christina and then Jen next, and Steve will come back to you at the end. But Christina, if you want to pick up that thread or share more about lessons from ACORN that you think are most relevant today, and I think maybe something that would be particularly relevant, maybe Jen, this is something that you also want to touch on, is just the importance of building a united front against authoritarianism. And I'll say if there's anyone wants to drop any questions in the chat, we can take a look at and see if we have any time for questions at the end. I'm going to go Christina, Jen, and if we have time, Steve will come back to you for final thoughts.
Okay. Just to pick up on the thread that Steve was just laying out, I think it is critically important right now, as our organizations are under potential threat, to not be so attached to our organizational form that we shrink in order to not be attacked. I think we actually have to seek to do impactful enough work that we anticipate attacks coming toward us. And that means that we have to inoculate our allies, inoculate our funders, inoculate our members and our staff, so that when it comes, we actually have some plans in place about standing up together, about what the thread, the narrative is, how to actually expose what's really happening and why they're coming after us, and get in front of it in a way that we just were not able to when the ACORN takedown happened. I think just to transition to like the lesson, that the key takeaway that I would love for people to hold, there's a lot of talk right now about what needs to be done in order to stave off totalitarian, or like sort of the regime's attempts at taking down democracy, of installing authoritarianism, etc. And one of them is that we have to form these nerve centers. And I think it's easy for us to form what's been called the yes nerve center, like the what we're fighting for. It is so much harder for us to think about how to form a no coalition that spans ideology, but is standing up against authoritarianism together. And I think we didn't get a chance to talk much about it, but because when you knocked on the door as an ACORN organizer, you did not start with a political ideology, which was a real critique of ACORN, absolutely, but it allowed us to actually pull in people who otherwise would not be pulled into our fights and win together. And in this moment, that sort of broad front of ideologies to push back is deeply needed, and the muscle to pull off that kind of thing is sorely underworked. So there are lots of lessons I think we could pull from that kind of organizing, talking about billionaire first agenda versus the rest of us, as opposed to talking about Republicans and Democrats and, even Trump. Like, there's lots of folks in our base who voted for Trump and maybe are not ready to say, I made a bad choice, but are ready to say, I want to save healthcare. I don't like what they're doing with these ICE raids, and if we can actually think about that orientation of how we pull people in, we will have a much greater chance of at least forming of individuals, a block of people who are ready to stand up together.
Yep, I can build off of that. We didn't talk to each other about our lessons, but mine was the ACORN being non-ideological meant that the identity that we organized around was like, we don't live in well-off neighborhoods, and we can relate to a lot of things that are happening and acknowledge the world was less polarized then. But like, there is something to be said for building a thing that by definition is unifying. And once people were in ACORN, we did have very little trouble with internal schisms around ideological or identity lines, because that's not what they came in for. And then I think another lesson I would pull is this sort of building trust and skills through doing the work rather than training or talking about it. So these days we do a lot of talking about trust and being relational and story of self and that kind of stuff. We have whole mini industries of consultants built up to teach us how to talk to one another and tell our stories, recruit each other to action and build trust. But at ACORN, I feel like trust was built by doing things and winning things together. And our model moved people into taking collective action kind of as fast as possible. Sometimes people who knew very little about each other, and they just knew that they'd agreed that this thing needed to be cleaned up or that thing wasn't fair. And it feels like we talked less and we did more. And the research we did was campaign research. What was the minimal thing we had to know to begin to launch something in the real world? And we talked to enough people that we understood how to identify the issues that would move people together. And relatedly, people got engaged not because we laid out a bold vision. We didn't do a lot of visioning or explaining the promise of ACORN, because we put them in rooms and on buses and in the streets and at negotiating tables where they and other members could experience the potential power of it themselves. We didn't have to tell them about the vision of ACORN. We just let them actually experience it. And then the last thing I would say is that relatedly, there's a lot of jokes about how ACORN lacked formal organizing and management training. We just sort of, on both the staff and the member side, we just threw people into situations with little experience or preparation. And there are some major oversights and things we just were outright derelict about. And some of that made us vulnerable, right, when they came for us in the end. But I think the pendulum has swung too far the other way. There's a lot to be said for learning by doing. And in fact, sometimes nothing can stand in for it. And we tolerated more uncertainty and discomfort and lots of trial and error and lots of mistakes and disappointing outcomes. But people learn important lessons fast that way. And I personally learned a ton. And then relatedly, there was a lot more DIY where there was less role differentiation on staff. So there was just experience differentiation, but not role different. People had to be good at lots of things: planning actions, recruiting members, raising money, designing flyers, writing testimony, figuring out campaign plans, developing leaders, and there are downsides to that. But I think, again, we may have overcorrected, and we talk about capacity now as if even people whose job is to manage consultants are desiring more capacity. And it just feels like that whole concept of capacity has changed since the ACORN days. And I feel like we've lost something in the well-rounded ability to react and be skilled around a range of things that build power.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes. Thank you, Jen. We have about 2 minutes left. Steve, did you have any final thoughts or lessons learned that you wanted to share? You are on mute.
The final thing I'll say is one of the things I loved about ACORN was that we were national. And, I'm at Popular Democracy, which is a national network. I am a fan and advocate for national networks. And the reason is because, power operates at national and even international levels, but our corporate enemies and our political enemies operate at national levels. And we need organizations or networks of organizations deeply rooted locally that can come together in national fights and build power at the national level, where we can take on the very powerful enemies that we're all facing. And that, I think, was a huge strength of ACORN's.
I think that is a wonderful note to close out on. I want to thank the three of you for joining and agreeing to be panelists for tonight's discussion. I want to thank everyone who joined in or who watches this panel. And I hope folks enjoyed the conversation and are able to carry some of these takeaways forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.